Hello, welcome to Brave New History. We're here with Jaime Paul Lamb, author of Approaching the Middle Chamber. And thank you so much for coming.
Elliot, thanks so much for having me. I've watched your show. I'm a fan, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, what is the Middle Chamber?
So the Middle Chamber is it's part of a lecture in the second degree of Freemasonry, the Fellowcraft degree. So the Middle Chamber is, well, just on its own, it's a piece or an area in King Solomon's temple. So there was the Middle Chamber where the Fellowcrafts received their wages, and then so we talk about this in the second degree of Freemasonry, again the Fellowcraft degree, and there's an extensive lecture that one travels a staircase consisting of 3, 5, and 7 steps to enter the middle chamber of King Solomon's temple. And this staircase is particularly interesting because it consists of, on the flight of 7 steps, of the 7 liberal arts and sciences. So we're encouraged as Masons to study the 7 liberal arts and sciences, and by that knowledge and by that sort of really the building blocks of a classical education. Not that every Mason actually undertakes this journey, right? But we're encouraged to study the 7 liberal arts, and at the fruition, just as in a classical education, you would enter into subjects such as philosophy and theology.
Yeah.
Sound about right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And let's see, is there any mysticism behind the 357?
Well, sure, yeah. So that was something I wrote a lot about, just unpacking the symbolism of the number 3, everything from the Platonic hypostases or the Neoplatonic hypostases, the Christian hypostases. In the Masonic context, it's birth, life, and old age, or youth, manhood, and old age. It also, the flight of 3 steps alludes to the jewels of the 3 principal officers of the lodge. So if I can get those in order, the plumb, the level, and the square. Yeah, the plumb, the level, and the square. And is that right? The junior warden is the plumb.
Yes.
The senior warden is the level. How do we meet on the level? Yes, that's right. So it corresponds to 3 working tools of both operative and speculative Masons. And then the flight of 5 steps allude to the 5 senses, as well as to the orders of architecture. So that's a really interesting little piece that they kind of unpack there, a sort of Vitruvian segue there on the flight of 5 steps. And they, delineate the differences between the 5 orders. They isolate the 3 Greek orders from the 2 additional Roman orders. And then, as we were saying, the flight of 7 steps consists of the 7 liberal arts and sciences primarily. I've heard some good arguments for planetary associations in terms of the Ptolemaic cosmological model, in that you have the 7 planets, the 7 visible planets, in their Ptolemaic or Chaldean order. So from the moon to Mercury to Venus to the sun to Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and those corresponding to the 7 steps on the winding staircase, as we call it. But you were asking particularly about the mystical aspects of it. And I think overall there is a theme, sort of an overarching theme of what you might call anabasis, or an anagogic ascent, this sort of particularly in that Ptolemaic context of, rising through the spheres, might be
Gotcha.
another way to put it.
Or when we say anagogic, that means ascending?
Yeah, so sort
Yeah.
of particularly a mystical ascent, I think, is how it's generally used. Um, but of course, the object, what's interesting is that once you do climb this flight of winding stairs, you end up in the middle chamber. And the middle chamber is where, as we said, operative craftsmen would receive their wages in the middle chamber. And we receive speculative wages there as well. Corn, wine, and oil. So there's some, just one quick grab on some mystical kind of element of that is corn, wine, and oil, and their correspondence to salt, sulfur, and mercury. So,
Okay.
so there's sort of an alchemical motif there. I unpack that quite a bit in that book, where corn would be the salt, so the body, because they meant it in terms of like corned beef. When you corn something, you preserve it with salts. Wine would of course be the mercury, because wine is the mercury
Okay.
of the mercury of the grape. And
Yeah.
sulfur would be the oil, just as the essential oils in, say, a Paracelsian spagyric alchemical operation.
Sure.
The distillation of oils correspond to the wage of oil. So I think it's a pretty neat system, and there is reason for us to suspect that that was intentionally deposited there, because when you think of people like Desaguliers, Elias Ashmole, who was an ardent collector of alchemical codices, um, there's every reason to, and many early speculative or accepted Masons, that is to say, Masons who are not operative stonemasons in the quarries or on cathedrals, etc., but the more speculative metaphysical variety, which leads me to kind of another thing, unpacking the mysticism of that. And it's something I deal with in my third book called The Archetypal Temple, is that the real distinction between the operative and speculative denominations. So, of course, Masonic lodges were peopled by operative stonemasons for the majority of their history since, say, the Roman guild system and the collegia. Well, we have this distinction that we talk about in that lecture, the middle chamber lecture, about the operative and speculative denominations in the craft. And the speculative Mason is also a temple builder, but not a physical temple. The speculative or accepted Mason is a sort of metaphysical temple builder. So that's kind of that's like the elephant in the room in terms of Masonic work, as far as I'm concerned, because if you ask people, what is Freemasonry, let's say, you're likely to get the tired old Prestonism, that it's a beautiful system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols, I think, is what the response that we all learn very
Sure.
early on in our studies. But I've offered another definition, a complementary definition in the Archetypal Temple, that the speculative Freemason is a metaphysical temple builder, and that we do this on various planes. So you're a Mason, I'm a Mason. We know that there is a tremendous amount of mnemonic work. There's a tremendous amount of memory work, particularly if you're taking offices and participating in degrees and things. So you have to learn lectures, and you have to learn the parts of the various officers and things. And these, I argue in that book, that these are designed to help us erect a mnemonic temple internally, because you probably know from your Masonic labors that when you are memorizing the certain parts, they always give you directionality. Where were you then placed? Oh, in the northeast corner. You know, where did you then go? And then I went from, I was instructed to go from the worshipful master, reconducted back to the senior warden in the west. And they always say east, west, south, northeast corner, things like the north being the place of darkness. So because of all this orientation and directionality, and the memory work, you're creating a memory temple, as one would a memory palace, let's say, in that popular mnemonic motif. So that, to my mind, if we're talking about the mystical elements of Freemasonry, that's a central thing. It's the central project of the craft, to build temples. So by creating that mnemonic temple, we are contributing to the egregorical temple that all Masons share. So an egregore being like a thought form, essentially. So that would be, and eventually, after hitting all these levels, the mnemonic, the egregorical, the astral, the celestial, finally we end up at that house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens, which is, the heavenly or Empyrean temple. So there's this stratification of the temple archetype that I think is so central to speculative Masonic work. I kind of went off on a tangent there, but
yeah, no, that's good. There's a lot to say. I'm really interested in the corn, wine, and oil. Like it seems really out of place, so with that, you would think that there's some symbolic meaning to it, right? So, like for me, when something is clearly contradictory or doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, we're fitting symbolism into it, right? That it's meant to be true in a different sense, right?
Absolutely.
So, corn, like I knew that was synonymous with salt, and that would make a whole lot more sense because salt, that's what Roman soldiers were paid in, right? It's
the word salary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Salary comes from salt. Yeah. And so, I mean, it would make sense to be paid in salt. Yeah. And then wine. Well, and William Preston, he's the one who originated the staircase idea. And he was British. And I think in Britain, they say, for corn, spirits. They say maize.
Yeah. I thought you were going with the wine thing in that they say spirits, spirits for alcohol.
I thought, wasn't spirits just hard alcohol?
It might be the further distillation or the further, what would it call? I forget the exact term, but the further reduction, like for instance, brandy or brandy wine is, I think the etymology says it's something like burnt wine, because it's reduced to its most potent form in that, within those parameters. Brandy wine is burnt wine in that they reduced it down to a harder alcohol. But of course we didn't get I'm not sure when precisely we got it was probably during the golden age of Islam before the word alcohol, of course, comes from Islamic alchemy, right?
Okay.
Alcohol, I think it is alcohol.
Yeah. I think, the discoverer of alcohol was named Alcohol, like an Arabic guy. That was his name.
Right.
That's my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. So to finish the point on this alchemical sort of symbolism that I kind of unpack in that book, approaching the middle chamber, is that there's a certain operation, there's a certain species of alchemy called spagyria. And spagyria basically, it comes from the Greek to separate and combine. We know it in Latin as solve et coagula. Solve to separate, coagula to combine, coagulate. So in Paracelsian alchemy, that is to say the alchemy of, let's see if I can do his whole name, Philippus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, aka Paracelsus. He was a wet path or vegetable kingdom alchemist primarily because he was a physician, and he would make tinctures. Now the difference is most tinctures at that time were just the what you would call the mercury and the sulfur. So they just had the alcohol content and the essential oils and put those back together in a tincture. But what differentiates a Paracelsian spagyric tincture is that it has the body as well, and the body is the salts, or the body are the salts. So the way the operation would go, and I've done one for every day of the week because I've done their planetary correspondences. So what you do is you take an herb, let's say, like basil, and you would dry it out. You would put it, or you would take a bunch of it and ferment it and get the alcohol content. You could do it that way, but you need a lot of it. Or you could use a universal vegetable mercury, which is just grain alcohol. If you go buy a little fifth of grain alcohol, put that in a jar, put the dried basil in the jar, give it 40 days, which is an alchemical month, to sort of leach out the essential oils in the plant matter, or your prima materia, the first matter. And then you wait 40 days, you strain it out so you have the alcohol content, which has leached out the essential oils. So essentially you have the mercury and the sulfur. And then you take that macerated sludge that is left over, that has been soaking in alcohol, you put it in like a Pyrex dish, touch a flame to it, and burn it to white ash. And when you get that white ash, you collect that. Hopefully you can get it to white ash. A lot of the time it stays gray and sort of black, but if you put it under the broiler, you get it to go all the way to white. You take that white ash, you put it in a petri dish or some shallow jar with distilled water. It's important to use distilled water because it has no mineral content. And you put it on the windowsill or something, and you let it sit until it evaporates. And if you do that enough times, you will end up with the little crystalline salts, the alkaline basic salts of that plant from the ashes. So it's almost like a Phoenician operation in terms of a phoenix. You know, you're getting this product from the calcinated ash. And once you have those basic salt alkaloids, you reintroduce those into the sulfur and the mercury. That is to say, the essential oils and the alcohol content.
Yeah.
And once you have that, then you have all three parts. You have the salt, sulfur, and mercury all in one tincture, and that makes it a spagyric tincture. And what's cool about it is it corresponds philosophically and esoterically to the mind, body, and spirit, the pneuma, anima, and psyche, to the spiritus, soma, and spiritus, corpus, and anima. That's what it is. So, yeah, and in the Greek, it's pneuma, psyche, soma. So you get this really great, like what we were just talking about, the hypostases, right? And it's almost like a chemical version of this hypostases. One substance differentiated into three constituent parts that are that again come together, solve et coagula. So it's a beautiful process. And I've done this with, how per Nicholas Culpeper, every herb has a planetary correspondence. So if you pick herbs that correspond to the days of the week, like rosemary is the sun, so Sunday, etc. Every plant corresponds to a certain planet per the great chain of being, like Ficino's great chain of being, etc. And this series of correspondences. So what I've done was and I show how to do this in that middle chamber book under the wages section, the wages of the fellowcraft. I've made tinctures for each day of the week from a certain planetary herb for each day. And then you can use those ritually. You could use those just with a dropper under your tongue just to get in touch with that particular planetary influence or that planetary intelligence. And you could use them, kind of segueing into astrology. You could use these tinctures as an alchemical sort of supplement. Let's say in your natal chart, you have a horribly placed Venus, for example. Well, you can do a sort of a sympathetic or homeopathic remedy by taking the Venus tincture when you need sort of Venusian influence in your life. Like, let's say you got a hot date or something like that. Not to be too mundane about it, but let's say you have a hot date and you really want to get in contact or, draw down the influence. That's a better way to put it, to draw down the influences of Venus. You would, partake of this tincture and maybe say the Orphic hymn to Venus or some, prayer to Aphrodite. And this is just part of, natural and celestial magic, per like Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, let's say. This stuff is all over Agrippa, if you've read his 3 books of occult philosophy. So he was a big Neoplatonist as well, Agrippa. Definitely a big fan of Porphyry.
Gotcha. So with keeping on going with corn, wine, and oil. So corn is the salt, and it sounds like when we talk about sulfur and mercury, we're not talking so much about like the elemental mercury or sulfur. We're talking about like sulfur is not the essential oil part. It's like the substantial part.
Exactly. They call those 3 the 3 philosophical principles, is what Paracelsus called them. So he introduced the salt, sulfur, and mercury sort of paradigm into chemistry or alchemy at this time. He introduced this as an alternative to Galenic and Hippocratic humoral theory. The humors, the temperaments and the humors. So whereas Hippocrates and Galen would talk about one being melancholic, sanguine, phlegmatic, or choleric, those were the 4 temperaments. Each of those temperaments correspond to a humor, a substance in the body, a liquid. Like sanguine would be blood, choleric would be yellow bile, melancholic would be black bile, and phlegmatic would be phlegm. So we have these. Paracelsus inherited this Galenic / Hippocratic humoral theory, but he was displeased with that. So he was building off of an Arabic contrivance that started to use different philosophical principles. And they had already had the sulfur and the mercury. So he introduced the salt to make this triumvirate of and again, an alternative to the humors and the temperaments. So he built his whole edifice around this new paradigm in alchemy, and I think some of that is present in the middle chamber lecture when we receive our wages, and in the just in general in the work of Freemasonry, because we know absolutely for sure that there were speculative alchemists in the early craft lodges.
Yeah.
That's not esoteric. It's not a cult or anything, which is another good point to kind of tack on to that. Is before the Enlightenment, which I think is an inaccurately named movement. Before the Enlightenment, chemistry and alchemy were one thing. Astronomy and astrology were one thing. Magic and technology were one thing. So the only difference between, let's say, astrology and astronomy is that astrology is predicated on the notion of an enchanted cosmos. It is predicated on the notion that there is a cosmic sympathy between the microcosm and the macrocosm, that there is some sort of resonant relationship. And same thing with alchemy and chemistry. Chemistry is merely disenchanted alchemy. You know, it's it's you know, but before the Enlightenment, like we tend to nowadays, from our perspective, we tend to think of astrology and alchemy and magic as being these occult, esoteric arts. Whereas as little as 350 years ago or something like that, that was just the standing paradigm in the sciences. They just happened to subscribe to the notion of an enchanted cosmos. And you could see that. Have you ever read Tilliard's Elizabethan world picture?
No.
It's
Yeah, I've not even heard of it.
it's a beautiful book. EGM or EGW Tilliard, Elizabethan world picture. So what he does in that book is he I want to say it was written about 50, 70 years ago, something like that. But he unpacks the poetry and some prose of Milton, Tennyson, Shakespeare, etc.
Yeah.
And he isolates those notions of an enchanted cosmos. He isolates those notions that there was a primum mobile, an unmoved mover, who emanated the divine will through the fixed stars in the zodiac. And through that stellar emanation, it came down through the planetary spheres as a ball bearing would go through tumblers in a pin game, you know?
Interesting.
The will came down through the 7 planetary spheres and took on qualities and was fated by going through and then finally it punctured the sublunary sphere, which is to say the sphere below the moon, sublunary sphere, into the realm of the 4 classical elements: earth, air, water, and fire, which according to even Aristotle and Ptolemy existed in the sublunary sphere where we live, and that is the sphere of generation and corruption and change and mutability. So they believed this all the way up to the Enlightenment. And that isn't to say that they were backwards thinking boneheads who didn't know that there were more than 4 elements, because they didn't, which is an argument sometimes leveled at this worldview. But they didn't think that there were 4 elements. Of course, they had notions, not atomic notions, but they had notions of other elements. Maybe not the 120 whatever it is we have now of atomically weighted elements, but so a way that's in the context of how they would have thought of this is solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. So solid is earth, liquid is water, gas is air, and plasma is fire. So these 4 states of matter that we still talk about today. I mean, that's not outdated, but all it was just a more symbolic terminology. Earth, air, water, and fire were merely the states of matter, and we say the four classical elements, and people get a good chuckle out of that, but it's only because they don't understand the context. And it's so difficult for us, from our modern disenchanted, frankly nihilistic perspective, in our materialist positivistic kind of paradigm where we are today, in a disenchanted cosmos. It's so hard for us to contextualize even something like Shakespeare or Tennyson, and certainly Neoplatonic, Hermetic, Gnostic literature, because
Mhm.
our and astrology as an edifice, as a whole, and alchemy, we just can't go there, because our worldview, having grown up with Little Rascals, Popeye, TV dinners, Starsky and Hutch, or whatever, however and the internet things, um, we we are so far removed from this panpsychism, really, this hylozoism kind of, this 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 world that is teeming with entities, with demons, with angels, with jinn. So part of my project, just personally, and I talk about this in my work as well. Not that I get too I don't, I use the uh, I used like the we plural. What's the voice I use? Next we'll discuss this and that. It's
Mhm.
called the plural, whatever. I forget what it's called.
Right.
But not that I give my opinions too much in my work. But I propose ideas. But one of them is that a thing that I'm working towards, and it's clear if you read between the lines, is a re-enchantment in my own personal paradigm. Uh, in fact, I know I've been going on a tangent right now, but one thing I wanted to add is that a couple years ago, I had been doing a lot of naked eye stargazing.
Mhm.
So just the unaided eye, just keeping track of the planets in signs and houses and referencing them against astrological charts. And I had a revelation one evening where it just came to me in a flash, and I thought, I was almost embarrassed with this thought. I thought, how arrogant is it for me to think that these heavenly bodies, that the cosmos itself does not have a meaning and purpose, an inherent meaning and purpose of its own, you know because it hither to that point, I had sort of a psychological model of almost a Kantian understanding of the cosmos, where I thought it might be a projection of my psyche into matter, you know,
Mhm.
and you get that in occultism as well when you talk to people who are into the secret or the Kabbalion or things like this, where I create my own reality, and that I've come to think of as almost a species of arrogance as well, because it's like, N- not quite, because the cosmos, and like I was saying, going back to that night a couple of years ago, it came to me in a flash, um, how arrogant for me to hold this view, and I kind of flipped the switch that evening, you know, to where um, I came closer to believing or feeling or knowing is the best word, I think. Knowing that the cosmos is animated, that it is ensouled.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about the the unmoved mover, right? And I would assume in the Elizabethan era, they would presume that's Christ, yeah, or that's
Yod He Vav
God,
He, the
yeah.
tetragrammaton, probably. Yeah.
And so we're kind of talking about, we're still thinking in Platonic terms, right? Even though, you know, they would put a lot into the Bible, right?
Mhm.
And they would just assume that's just how it is, right? Like
Right.
everybody knows how that is. There's spheres above us, right?
Yeah.
And you know, you wonder that with, you know, there's the mover on the outside putting in, uh arranging the constellations, arranging the spheres, right?
Hmm.
And that sounds a lot like uh the mystery schools and Mithraism, right?
Yeah.
And what, and the whole idea of, you know, ascending through the spheres, right, to get to that outer part, with kind of bringing us back to the middle chamber. We're talking about the ascension, right? And I learned the
Hmm.
new word, the
Anagoge.
anagog,
Yeah.
anagage, right?
Yeah.
And you know, you wonder if that's what they're not or that's what they're talking about with the middle chamber, right?
Yeah, and you can I make sort of an argument adjacent to that in my first book, Myth, Magic, and Masonry, because there is a section near the end where I deal specifically with the relationship that Freemasonry has to Mithraism, just conceptually. I'm not drawing a unbroken line of
Yeah,
transmission, but conceptually, like for instance, they were called Syndexoi, brothers of the grip. You know, you had a handshake with the Potter, you know, the
yeah,
sort of father of the lodge, the worshipful master of the lodge. There were many correlatives. You can go through them. There's lots of way, like their grade structure and this
yeah,
middle chamber, like we're talking about. So, Mithraic grades were certainly a planetary ascent, and they made no mystery of that. You could see it in the mosaic tiles that they had. That they, you know, there were even
okay,
certain working tools associated with each grade.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was about to interject that. It's striking, the maybe it's like there's this French term, like I forget it, scenes affair. I'm probably mispronouncing it, right? Like a scene that must come about,
Mm,
right? So like in you know, a mystery film, or like there's trench coats, there's, you know, uh certain elements that just kind of spring up, right?
yeah. Ubiquitous motifs.
Yeah, or like when you're out in space, you know, there's lasers, right? There's
Right.
stuff like that. And yeah, it's you're learning the passwords, presumably. We don't know a lot about Mithraism, but it would seem that you're learning the passwords of each grade as you go up. Like
Yeah.
when you go up, you'll say whatever to the archons.
Yeah, there
And
was a I'm sorry, go on.
oh yeah, and I mean, I'm just kind of going off on that, but
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know about the checkered pavement in the Mithraea. That's something.
A mosaic pavement, so it was a bunch of little tiles that were put together to form images. So not necessarily
Okay, got it.
not a Solomonic checkered pavement, but just like a mosaic pavement. And you were talking about the signs or grips or modes of recognition, and but oh, you were talking about elements of the ritual, what we know of
Mhm.
Mithraic grade ritual. One thing that they found, I think it was among I think Franz Kuman
Yeah.
brings this up about there's a fragment of the Leo grade where it's striking. Any Mason would be like, I know this, because it says, how became you a Leo?
Mhm.
The Pater asks, and then the candidate says, well, I was put in a pit, and I forget the rest
Mhm.
of it, but there's a bunch of
Yeah.
ellipses there because we're missing some pieces. But it's clearly a catechism.
Yeah.
It's a dialectical catechism, sort of, much like our Masonic work.
Yeah, that's one thing that struck me as well. There's the, I forget what it's called, but that there's it's, you know, the the manuscript has seen better days, right? But it's like what, like, yeah, it's like what happened to you next. And
Yeah.
And then you say this, right? Which is, you wonder if the people who came up with the Masonic catechisms were familiar with this, because, you know, if Mithraism still existed, I'm sure they would file a copyright infringement against Freemasonry, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
You know, the best argument I've heard, I think, is in Mackey. He does sort of skirt around an argument for a linear transmission by saying that operative stonemason guilds, after the dissolution of the Roman collegia, the Fabrizi and things like that, the Lombard and the Comacene masters, after they dispersed, sort of, some of them ended up in Scotland, which is true. And we have Mithraea and Tauroctonies found in Scotland. We have
mhm,
Hadrian's Wall goes up at least to like Newcastle, pretty far. So we know that the Roman legionaries were up that way, and we know that the Roman legionaries were primarily Mithraists. That was a soldier's religion, a soldier's cult, the
mhm,
preferred cult of the Roman legionaries. And Mackey, Albert Mackey, for those who are not Freemasons or familiar with him, but Albert Mackey made a pretty good argument that the legionaries, or the guildsmen who were up that way, transmitted the Mithraic grade system, the Mithraism in general, to the Picti in Scotland. So the Picti, or the Picts, who were up in Scotland. So you could read it in Mackey. I don't remember the particulars of his rationale or his argument there, but I remember it being interesting, and I read it probably 4 or 5 years ago, when I was 5, 6 years ago, when I was researching for myth, magic, and masonry.
yeah, that's an interesting idea. Like proto-operative Masons,
Yeah.
which, yeah,
Yeah, so even that operative speculative dynamic, we tend to think that that happened in the 17th century, when you start to see people like Elias Ashmole on the
mhm,
rolls, people who were definitely accepted speculative Masons. We tend to um, draw the line there, delineate that point as when there started to be a tip in the scales began to tip from operative lodges to speculative lodges. But I would say that, and I'm not the only one to have argued this, I would say that there has always been a speculative element to the operative craft. I think it's always just been couched in there, because if you look at things like Chartres Cathedral, many of the cathedrals in Europe, the medieval cathedrals, um, there are many symbols and motifs that certainly sort of allude to astrological and astronomical phenomena, like the four living creatures, or the tetramorph, right? So you see that on a lot of I think it's called the timpani, the on the facade of many cathedrals. You'll sometimes see St. John, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in the Upper West Side of New York City has a really good one, actually, as well, of the four living creatures, who are the lion, the ox, the eagle, and the man. And these go back to Ezekiel, is where we sort of first encounter them in Scripture.
mhm,
But we have to remember that Ezekiel was part of the Babylonian captivity. So he was in Babylon, right? And what they had in Babylon at that time were statues called the Lamassu. Have you heard of the Lamassu statues?
nope, nope,
So they are composed of the head of a man, the body of a bull or a lion, or a mix of, always a mix of the two, the hooves up front and the paws in the back, perhaps, and they had wings of an eagle. So they were composed of the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle. And these go all the way back to I don't know if they go as far back as Sumer, but they certainly go as far back as, let's say, Akkad or Acadia. And these relate to the 4 royal stars of the Persians, which are situated in the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac. And when we say the lion, the ox, the eagle, and the man, we are symbolically talking about Leo, Taurus, Scorpio, and Aquarius. These were 2 diametrically, they were on the axis of the fixed signs of the zodiac. So I think they could pretty much say for sure that since they did have the zodiac during the Babylonian captivity, because the zodiac, I think, was fully established by about, I want to say, 600 or 700 BCE, when we had the complete zodiac that we know today. Might have been as late as 400, but it was sometime around then. But pieces of the zodiac go back as far as, well, some would argue go back as far as Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is about 10,000 years ago, because there are certain carvings that allude to zodiacal positions, not necessarily the zodiacal signs we know today, but other sort of asterisms and constellations. But there's a fascinating book on this subject by Rupert Gleadow. Rupert Gleadow wrote a book about 50, 60 years ago called The Origin of the Zodiac. 50, 60 years ago. But it's a pretty scholarly work, but a layperson could read it. It's not as dense as like the CCAG sort of critical editions of ancient astrological fragments and things. But yeah, so operative and speculative, we see this dynamic going back a lot further than the 17th century. Oh, and there was also a square found near some Irish bridge, if I remember correctly, a square from the Middle Ages. I want to say something like the 11th or 12th century, a Mason square that was inscribed with the moral and ethical. I forget the exact inscription, but it was something relating the moral and ethical significations of the tools to the operative. So it was they were talking about like moral rectitude and squareness, square dealing. But I'd have to find it. But I look up Irish square bridge, masonry or something like that. It'll probably come up.
Yeah, and with operative and speculative, I've been wondering, I was reading through Timaeus, right? And it dawned on me that this is a lot like the Middle Chamber lecture, in that we have the Platonic idea of there's pure forms, right? They don't exist in the physical. They're like ideas, thoughts.
Sure.
And then we have solid bodies? I don't know what the opposite of the ideal forms are. You have idea above, and then you have the actual thing. So the thing above is like speculative masonry, and then the thing below is the substantive thing. That's
exactly. So I think he had the noetic realm of the forms and ideas, so this abstract realm, and then I think was the realm of the anima mundi, or the world soul, I think is what they called it in their hypostases. The realm of the noetic realm, then the realm of the soul, and then I think there was I think the bottom kind of Malkuth, if you're into Kabbalah, that world of generation and corruption, as we see in Aristotle. I think he called it the physis, the physical world,
Mhm.
if I remember that particular stratification. But and yes,
Yeah.
I could totally see that in terms of the operative speculative dynamic, and it's like how we started this conversation, because we find that the operative stonemason builds physical three-dimensional structures, whereas the speculative Freemason um, sort of works on a more metaphysical or rarefied plane, like the mnemonic plane, the plane of memory, like the egregorical plane, the plane of a collective thought form that all Masons share because we've all
Mhm.
done the same labors, and also that most rarefied noetic intellectual realm of your celestial temple, or even
Mhm.
to the more theological realm, and in keeping with the trajectory of a classical education. Once you get through the trivium and the quadrivium, you move on to philosophy and then theology. So we have that as well, where the most rarefied realm in Masonry of the temple archetype is that house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So again, this sort of capstone
Mhm.
of our work is the most rarefied and most formal, or idealistic.
Yeah. And so we're up there, right? So we reach the middle chamber and receive the wages. Is there Why do you think it's the middle chamber, not the holy of holies, or the what's the other one, like the
Sanctum Sanctorum, Holy of Holies.
yeah, well, so there's middle chamber, there's three chambers there, right? There's the middle where everything that's used for storage. There's the holy of holies, and then the holy place, right?
Yeah,
Inside yeah.
wouldn't the holy place be the Sanctum Sanctorum?
I
It's
think
that's
there's like it's like when you're going in like an old school Catholic church,
mhm.
there's like where they have the altar,
Yeah,
or maybe it's like an Orthodox church, and
the
then behind
apse.
that
It's
it's
the
only for the
apse.
priests.
Yes, behind the veils.
Yes,
Right.
yeah. So there's
I
the
think that I think that's called the apse, isn't it? I
I
don't.
don't know,
I
yeah,
kind of don't remember myself, but
but I think it's modeled after King Solomon's temple. That like there's this holy place, and then behind that is the holy of holies, where you're there goes my camera, where you're not supposed to go,
right.
and or like only the high priest once a year,
Yeah.
and but the middle chamber is storage, right? Have you thought about that? Like, why the middle chamber?
Yeah, it does. It is kind of strange, right? Because why do we take this? Well, we go up there to get the wages. We know that. So just going by what it says, what is that in First Kings or Chronicles? I think is where they describe this, and they do, if I remember correctly, describe the wages of corn, wine, and oil in there. I know corn, wine, and oil are
Okay.
mentioned several times in Scripture. So one reason why, well, we can investigate this from the inside by saying, we know in Masonic ritual, you not only receive the wages there, but you receive the let's see, there's corn, wine, and oil. You get the G lecture there.
Hmm.
Do you guys have the G lecture?
Yeah.
So where you are encouraged, the candidate is encouraged to study the art and science of geometry in order um, to trace nature in her most hidden recesses, or something like that. Bad paraphrase, but to 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 find nature in her most hidden recesses, I believe, or something like that. It
Yeah.
says.
Yeah.
But there's also the attentive ear, the instructive tongue, and the faithful breast that we encounter there. So there's some moral and ethical teachings there. There are I would argue, alchemical wages, which also have their own. They are also kind of symbolic of of the mind, body, spirit, triune nature of man, you might say, and then the G lecture. So that's a big deal that we encounter G there. We encounter geometry, but also God. And it says in the lecture that it stands for both.
Yeah.
So why that doesn't happen in the Sanctum Sanctorum or Holy of Holies, I'm not sure. We'd have to get a Ouija board and try and contact Desaguliers and Preston.
Yeah. Where I wonder, I've thought about it, and within like rabbinical thought and mysticism, that they compared the middle chamber to where the soul is, or at least the permanent soul or the immortal soul. Like they have this idea of that there's three souls, like one.
Oh, the Nefesh, the Ruach, and yes, I know what you're talking about.
Okay, yeah, and Plato had a similar idea, or
yes.
Socrates did, and Plato is relaying it, and
right.
that they've. It was something like, well, you have to get your hands dirty, and the holy place and the Holy of Holies, those aren't really approachable. So it's in the doing. It's in the more utilitarian space that you would have like this unchanging soul, right?
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that makes sense because we know that Preston, after his father died at an early age, I think it was, he was raised by a classics professor, right? So you would necessarily be familiar with the works of Plato, which is a reason why I think the staircase lecture or the middle chamber lecture is based off of Timaeus, right?
Sure.
Where it's kind of funny how at the very end of Timaeus, instead of like where in the middle chamber lecture you're receiving your wages, right? Like you've climbed the pinnacle.
Right.
In Timaeus, he's talking about how people who didn't are punished by becoming stupid animals in the next life.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so it's kind of like instead of being rewarded for virtue, you're punished for vice.
Yeah.
In the Timaic version, right?
It's kind of via negativa, or what you do. Yeah, it's almost like how things are flipped in, let's say, the weighing of the heart in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. How you don't say it's basically the commandment.
Negative confession, right?
Negative confession, right? You know what else is interesting about Preston that may have informed his notion of the middle chamber and the soul, in addition to his classics background and the stepfather, you said, right?
Yeah.
And he was also, we know that he was a member of the Kabbalah Club in London.
Okay.
Yeah, so he was, that's on record. He was at least curious about Kabbalistic doctrine and was a member of a society.
So it stands to reason that he'd be influenced by Jewish mysticism.
Yeah. Oh, he absolutely would be. And look at things, even something as simple as, say, the pillars, J and B, you know. So, and their relation to the pillar of severity and the pillar of mercy. So
yeah, and you know, I've wondered with Kabbalah, is there a third pillar?
There is the middle pillar. So wisdom, strength, and beauty, if we attach it to that, we can do in the Kabbalistic tree of life, we find the pillar corresponding to B, right, is the pillar of severity, and atop that is the Sephira Bina, it's called, and Bina is understanding. On top of the pillar corresponding to J in the Masonic Lodge is the Sephira Hesed, and Hesed is wisdom. And then beauty, and then the middle pillar on the Kabbalistic tree of life, it is topped by the Sephira Keter. Now, in the middle of that pillar, though, there is the pillar, the Sephira Tiferet, which is beauty. And on that first pillar we were talking about, the one corresponding to B, the second Sephira down on it is called Gebura, which corresponds to Mars and strength. So there is a strength, beauty, and wisdom motif, and they are separated on those three pillars. So absolutely you could make an argument about the three principal supports of the lodge: wisdom, strength, and beauty, and their associated officers, pedestal officers, as corresponding to as having a Kabbalistic kind of undergirding.
Yeah.
And Preston would know that. He would have known that.
Yeah. And going on with similarities with Timaeus, right? In the very beginning, here's the terrestrial sphere, here's the celestial sphere, right? And that we have that where he talks about the alive earth, right? And then there's the unmovable, or what is it called? The fixed stars.
Yeah,
right?
The same and the different. Doesn't he call them
Yeah.
the same, the sphere of the same and the sphere of the different? Right? I think that's what he says.
I don't know. He talks about the celestial, like, sphere of the fixed stars, but I don't know if they talk about the earth as a sphere. But I mean, I think it's strongly implied that it is a sphere, but I don't think they ever outright say it in there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and we certainly have that in the Masonic Lodge, because atop those two pillars we've been talking about is on top of one of them is the terrestrial sphere, and on top of the other one, very plainly, is the celestial sphere, which I think definitely goes back to, has Platonic roots, I'm sure. One place where I think it kind of really picks up steam in terms of that transmission, this Platonic transmission, hitting this Kabbalistic point with Preston and then into Masonic work. One place where it really picks up steam is in Hermeticism. So one of the central concepts of Hermeticism and Stoicism as well, because Posidonius, he was a proponent of the doctrine of cosmic sympathy, right? And we see this more fleshed out in the Hermetic context, where they constantly talk about the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm. And that's what later finds itself reiterated in Kabbalah. We see it in the Sefer Yetzirah, we see it in the Zohar, and again, Preston would be familiar with all of these. He would be familiar with that complete chain. He would know about the Platonic, the roots of this idea in Timaeus. He would know about the Hermetic and Stoic milieu, let's say in Alexandria, where you have the Hermetists, you have Gnostics, you have Neoplatonists. He would certainly know about the Kabbalistic link in that chain, being a member of the Kabbalah Club, and then he would, it's only natural that he would, in being the architect of our work, that he would introduce some of these ideas that are so, we were just talking about these motifs that must occur.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit of a mystery how things kind of got together. Like even just having the pillars with the spheres at their top is a little, because I mean I don't think that was mentioned as existing at King Solomon's temple, right? So it seems to have popped out of nowhere, right? So there has to be something Kabbalistic or Platonic about that, but I don't know. It's not clear to me where that comes from.
I think we did a pretty good job of tracing that. I mean,
okay, so you have like the Kabbalistic pillars, but why the spheres at the top?
To introduce that Hermetic notion, and that's not out of place, because even if you look in Anderson's Constitutions, Hermes Trismegistus is mentioned in there, as are the two pillars of Lamech and Seth and Thoth.
Huh. In the Anderson Constitutions?
Yeah, there's this.
Huh.
I think near the beginning, there's the legendary account of the transmission of Freemasonry, going all the way
Got
back
it.
to Adam. So I think they start with Adam, and there are stops along the way, much like what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Hermes Trismegistus, um, and and certainly Lamech and Seth, and how you remember how I know you've heard this story before, how there were two pillars made to contain the knowledge and wisdom of the civilization, essentially, and they were erected to withstand the conflagrations of fire and the inundations of water. So two pillars, one of them stone, the other one was bronze. In some legends they work out like that, and they were in supposedly Hermes or Thoth inscribed them with the collected knowledge of civilization, and they had made it through the deluge. And I'd have to go back and read Anderson's constitutions, but there is certainly a long um, legendary account of the Masonic transmission, or that Masonic current, going all the way back to Adam.
Interesting. And
Yeah,
I know that's referenced in the Middle Chamber lecture. But there's like a mystical origin, and that there's an earlier origin to that story.
absolutely. Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. Well, you remember, I think it was, well, in the story of Lamech, he had sons. Jubal was one of them, and maybe Tubal Cain, but Jubal was the inventor of music, and he had sons who were the inventors of, one was for agriculture, another one was for architecture, another one for music, if I remember correctly, and all
Right.
of these. All of these arts, these, where we've reached the apex of civilization at that time, they wanted those things recorded, and they were documented on two pillars meant to withstand the end of times, I guess, or the whatever the uh, the apocalyptic event was, right?
Yeah.
So, mhm.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah. So that explains that with the pillars. I mean, that there were safe deposits, right?
Yeah,
And with the whole whoever that was, Jubal or his sons, kind of would explain the seven liberal arts. You know why that's kind of on his mind.
yeah.
And also in Timaeus they talk about the five senses,
Mm.
which struck me. That's kind of where I put it together, that this is strikingly similar to the Middle Chamber lecture,
I'm gonna
right?
have to go back and read it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And as I'm going through it, there's the five forms, like the five physical forms,
Oh, the
right?
Platonic solids.
Platonic solids, yeah. There's
Yeah,
five of them on which the earth, like that's everything physical is based off of that. Like
yeah.
water is like the one with the most
Icosa.
surfaces.
The water is the icosahedron.
Yeah.
Fire is the tetrahedron, which is just the four-sided solid. I think Earth is the
Cube.
hexahedron, or the cube,
Yeah.
hexahedron, um, and air is the dodecahedron. Oh, no, 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 that's not true. The dodecahedron, the 12-sided one, is ether. So
Sure.
you have the four empedoclean elements in the tetrahedron, the icosahedron, the hexahedron, and I forget the other one, but then there's the fifth one, which is the dodecahedron, or the 12-sided solid, and that corresponds to the ether. So the ether, we were talking about this earlier as well, but this is a good time to interject this, is the ether. Aristotle would later associate the ether with the planetary spheres. So we had the four classical Empedoclean elements, earth, air, water, and fire, in the sublunary sphere. But from the moon through Saturn, actually from the moon through the fixed stars in the zodiac, that whole expanse of etheric spheres, they were composed not of the elements at all, but completely of ether. And Aristotle's sort of rationale for that was that they were immutable and unchangeable, unlike earth, air, water, and fire, which are in a constant melee, a constant war of change and generation and corruption. But the etheric spheres were sort of adamantine. They were fixed, never changed. They were regular,
Mhm.
and I think yeah, and then beyond that, who did Plato put beyond that? Just the some noetic. I
I
forget.
don't I don't think he ever explains it, at least not in Timaeus. I don't think he ever goes into what's beyond that.
He talks about it a little in the myth of air, in the 10th book of the Republic, where it's essentially, are you familiar with that little sequence in the Republic, the myth of air, it's called, where it's a
I'm not.
near-death experience. This Pamphylian, if I got that correctly, a
Mhm.
Pamphylian soldier called Air, E-R, he has a near-death experience, and he finds himself outside of the fixed stars and zodiac.
Okay.
His soul is outside of the fixed stars and zodiac, and he sees several gates. He sees two gates going into the earth and two celestial gates. And these celestial gates, Porphyry makes an argument that these have to do with the gate of Cancer and the gate of Capricorn. One gate through which souls ascend, and one gate through which souls descend. And Plato is talking about this. And in fact, it's a Homeric idea. This goes all the way back to Homer, because in the cave of the nymphs sequence in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is in, it's right near the end. He's dropped off there by whoever that seafaring civilization was. They dropped him off there, and he's near Ithaca. He's almost home, and he encounters the nymphs in this cave, and they talk about a tree, which is the world axis, and they talk about the river that runs through it, or the stream that runs through it, and that is the Milky Way. And they talk about the Crator and Amphora, which are these like jugs, essentially, which Porphyry says have to do with the planetary spheres. So yeah, so back to the myth of air, the soul, the pre-incarnate human soul, sits outside of the cosmos, where it is coupled with a daimon, or a demon, its own personal genius, like Socrates had a
Yeah.
genius, a demon. And the soul is coupled with the daimon, which would become the word demon.
Yeah.
And
Although, like for our listeners, it basically means spirit. It's not evil. It's not. Yeah.
exactly. Oh yeah, this is way before the demonization of the demon.
Yeah.
Um,
That's funny.
but yeah, and then the daimon. That's why I always just say daimon, just to separate it enough so people know I'm not talking about Linda Blair and The Exorcist.
Well, yeah. Oh, geez Louise. All right. Here, I'll. If you say daimon, shoot. I'm trying to see if this is a better camera angle.
Yeah.
Probably not. I don't know. But jeez.
Yeah. So the daimon, the soul chooses a daimon outside of the fixed stars and zodiac, and then that daimon guides the soul as a mystagogue or a psychopomp, guides the soul down into the underworld, which is actually the terrestrial world, down through the spheres. Now, there's an interesting astrological idea, and something I've been doing a lot of work on over the past 6 months or so, and working on a manuscript and things. How, when the soul, according to the 10th book of the Republic, the soul is guided down through the 7 planetary spheres by the personal daimon, what Iamblichus later calls the personal daimon. And at each planetary sphere on the way down, so from Saturn to Jupiter to Mars, through the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, and then into the sublunary sphere of the elements, at each one of those spheres, the soul takes on what Porphyry calls astral garments, he says. And that is to say, according to an astrological doctrine, which Porphyry would have been intimately familiar with, he was a Hellenistic astrologer. He was perhaps an astrologer above all else. And he would have known that at each one of those spheres, the soul takes on qualities associated with that planet. So for Saturn, if Saturn was poorly placed at the time of birth, Saturn would bestow or allot negative Saturnian significations. If Saturn was decently placed zodiacally, according to dignity and debility in astrology, if he was decently placed, just a middling placement, he would bestow neutral characteristics. But if he was fortunately placed, he would bestow his most positive significations, which would be things like discipline and structure and form, So imagine that for each of the planets. The soul is descending, guided by the psychopomp or mystagogue daimon. The soul is descending through each of these planetary spheres. It is taking on a quality associated with each of those planets until finally, at the prenatal syzygy, the soul and the body are yoked together, and then the native or subject of a natal chart is born. So that's the whole argument of natal astrology, is that we can look at somebody's natal chart and see the positions of their planets and basically reverse engineer their sort of descent through the 7 planetary spheres on their way down, and this gives us a character profile. Now, we know from Heraclitus, we know from one of his fragments, fragment 119 exactly, fragment 119 of Heraclitus, he says, ethos anthropos daimon, which is most popularly translated as character is destiny or character is fate. Now, think about what that means. That means that people tend to act within the confines of their character. In any given situation, you are likely going to act or react according to the composition of your character. That's just the way people are, right? Heraclitus noted this some 2,000 years ago plus, and says ethos anthropos daimon, character is destiny, because that is how we are propelled forward. Now, if we could look at somebody's natal chart and get an idea of the cosmic composition of their character, which is what the natal chart tells us, then we can make inferences based on that. Hence, natal astrology's predictivity. The reason why, and nobody ever talks about this, I'm working on this full manuscript of this idea, nobody talks about this. Natal astrology's predictivity from the Platonic perspective is based on the descent of the soul through the spheres and how that informs someone's character. And then the predictivity comes from, oh, I see what this character profile is, and I can make inferences based on this, and I will say, so and so is likely to act, you know, ABC, XYZ, whatever, act or react. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
a fascinating idea. I mean, it blows my mind. I mean, that's kind of like, again, it's bedrock astrological doctrine that nobody taught. It's so obvious, I think, that nobody looks at that.
Yeah. I've not heard that explanation before either.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, with what you're talking about, there's so many parallels that we can draw. Jacob's ladder, right?
Uh-huh.
Is the angels, I think it is, ascending and descending.
Yeah.
You wonder if that doesn't come from what school of thought was that?
Neoplatonism.
Got it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like,
and
yeah, then Iamblichus, Porphyry, and then even as late as people like Macrobius, who did a commentary on the dream of Scipio or Scipio. Um, so Neoplatonists, you know, even the later Neoplatonists and Numenius and some Middle Platonists as well, I think held a very similar cosmological view. Um,
yeah,
Numenius and Cronius, was it?
yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's beyond me. Though I'm also reminded I read this document that was supposed to be a Mithraic ritual. I thought it was the Mithraic liturgy, but I reread it and I didn't find it anywhere. So I forget what I was looking at, but it's a lot like what you were talking about. With you go up to the spheres, you put on different clothing,
Astral
right?
garments.
Yeah, and they're talking about how under Mithraism you put on different like armor, right? So you have like a helmet, let's say. I forget what pieces of equipment they are, and then you put on the breastplate,
Mm-hmm.
right? And think there's a thing in Ephesians where Paul talks about you put on the armor of faith, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I wish I could refer back to this document that I was looking at. I could have sworn I read this, but now I can't find the source, right?
Huh.
And you wonder if that's not what Paul is referring to as the ascent of the spheres, or he's from Tarsus, and that was the epicenter. That was the Mecca of Mithraism.
Hmm.
And so he would have to be familiar with Mithraism. And
Yeah.
you wonder if he's not getting the armor. Is that what it's called? The armor of faith?
I think,
something.
yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
And you wonder if it's related to that. Or, Paul says he knows a guy who went up to the third heaven, right? And that's a little bit weird,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like third heaven, there's multiple then, right?
Well, the seven heavens, right?
Yeah. And so I didn't know that was like multiple heavens were part of the Christian cosmology.
Right. Well, I think you see that kind of surface again with Pseudo Dionysius, and maybe even, who was the other one? Does not Aquinas deal with heavenly spheres? I'm sure
I don't know.
I'm sure it ends up in scholasticism, because that wasn't an esoteric notion. So I think, yeah, I'm certain that in that medieval worldview that Aquinas would have belonged to, and all the scholastics, they would have. Dante. Look at Dante talks about this in Paradiso, in the comedy. He definitely talks about ascent and descent through the spheres. And in fact, he even talks about a daimon of sorts, because I think it's Beatrix who is his guide through one of those anagogic ascents or a descent, I forget which. But he in fact sees people at various levels. And when Paul talks about the third heaven, if he's using Neoplatonism as a springboard, or Gnosticism, or Hermeticism, or any of those Alexandrian kind of cults, right? He could be saying, when he says, I know a guy who made it to the third heaven, he could be talking about somebody who had done a planetary ascent ritual up to the level of Venus, because Venus is the third heaven, because it goes the moon, then Mercury, then Venus. So that would be the third sphere. So he might have been alluding to someone who had undergone some sort of theurgical henosis, like a henostic kind of ritual, and made it to that sphere without getting beyond the sphere of the sun, perhaps. But that would not be crazy or out of place. To us it would be, because again, we don't have the same worldview or reference point. But to them, talking about the third heaven, particularly if you were a philosopher and a theologian, that wouldn't be weird at all.
Yeah. So when we're talking about ascending through the spheres, I have in mind that it's like a glass sphere, right? With like a little, who knows what, like a little knob on it. And that's the planet, right? And is that also the door to get to the next sphere?
I'm not sure if it was that defined. I think the doors, when we talk about the gates, generally that's said in the zodiacal context, so sometimes these ascents are planetary, sometimes they are zodiacal. And even though you think the zodiacal would be more horizontal than vertical, whereas the planetary ascent would be vertical, and because the zodiac is on the fixed star, the eighth sphere, the fixed stars in the zodiac, we tend to not think of the zodiacal ascent motif as much as we think of the vertical planetary motif through these, this latitudinal kind of spheres of the planets, if you look at it two-dimensionally. But there is a way to sort of make a zodiacal ascent as well, by entering the gate of Cancer and exiting the gate of Capricorn. And the reason why I say this is because Cancer, the zodiacal sign of Cancer, anciently as much as today, in the astrological doctrine, this is unchanged for over 2,000 years, that Cancer is ruled by the moon and Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. The moon is the lowest sphere to the earth. Saturn is the furthest sphere. So if you enter the gate of Cancer, as Porphyry talked about when he was explicating or did his sort of exegesis on the Cave of the Nymphs, and also talking about Plato's Myth of Air and the Republic, the soul can enter the gate of Cancer and exit the gate of Capricorn, because that's synonymous with saying the sphere of the moon and the sphere of Saturn. So it essentially is that planetary ascent. It's just looking at it through the lens of zodiacal rulership. So it's no violence is done to that ascent motif, whether you look at it planetary or zodiacally, because historically all the pieces are there and they always align. There's a consistency to this doctrine.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And just maybe just for the sake of getting on a further tangent, when with Mithraism, that they believe that he's like Atlas, he's on the outside of the last sphere, and my understanding, he's like Mithras is referred to as Sol Invictus, so he's like the hypercosmic sun that's outside the sphere. Right? So just as we have a sun, there's a sun outside of it, outside of like the dark sphere. And he's equated with Perseus, right? Mm-hmm. And that's just above the bull that's slaying the bull.
Yeah.
And I try to make sense of that. Like, why I mean, it makes sense a bit because, Perseus is above the bull.
Right.
He's above Taurus. Though, why would, I mean, okay, so he's responsible for the precession of the equinox because he can move it, right?
Like Ion. Yeah. Ion. Aion. You've encountered that before, right? Where it's
I've heard the term, but I think that's just about it.
yeah, he's standing inside of the wheel of the zodiac. Um, you see a lot of mosaics of him, but yes, I've come across a lot of that same research, and I've done some myself regarding the Perseus, the Persian, which is
Mhm.
also a grade in Mithraism, but he wears this Phrygian cap and things, and he's and the Phrygian cap I think is part of the Perseus grade or the Persian grade,
Yeah.
Perses. So he the constellation Perseus is on top of the constellation Taurus, much like in, for your readers who don't know the Tauroctony, obviously you do because you're talking about one being on top of the other, and I think the reason why you're saying that is because in the
Yeah, I guess I
Tauroctony,
kind of skipped a few steps in my
in,
explanation. Yeah.
in the Tauroctony, which is the most popular bas relief found in Mithraea, all over Europe, there is the bull is being slayed by Mithras, who is driving a short sword into its sort of shoulder, and underneath the bull, almost always, there is a dog, a scorpion, and a snake underneath on the underside of the bull, and then on either sides of this tauroctony scene, there is Cautis and Cautopates. They are two smaller figures, also with Phrygian caps. One has his torch pointing upward. The other one has his torch pointing downward. So these are solstitial entities, right? Solstitial um, personifications, much like our Saints John.
Hmm.
Our Saints John are, I argue, they're the same as Cautis and Cautopates. One is Saint John the Evangelist is the winter solstice. Saint John the Baptist is the summer solstice.
Yeah.
And Cautis and Cautopates are the solstices in the Mithraic
Yeah.
symbology. So yes,
And
he's on.
here, what do you think about, and it just occurs to me right now, the stewards and the deacons? Could they be equated where instead of up and down, it's white and black?
I think the stewards and the deacons certainly have planetary archetypal kind of significations, right? Because look at the senior deacon, for example. The senior deacon receives and conducts the candidates, but he also and visiting dignitaries, but he also carries messages from the master elsewhere about the lodge. So
Yeah.
he is absolutely hermetic, right? He is Hermes Mercury. He is at once the messenger and the guide of souls. He guides the candidate through the.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
He's a psychopomp who guides the candidate through the Hiramic tragedy. So, and that Hiramic tragedy in one of the Mithraic grades, I think it's the Heliodromos grade. The Heliodromos is guided by two figures who I think are Venus and Mercury because they're always with the sun. If you look at the sun always has Venus and Mercury because Mercury can't be any farther than 28 degrees from the sun, and Venus can't be any farther than 47 degrees. So that's why we always see Mercury and Venus in proximity, never further than 47 degrees from the sun, because they have inferior orbits to the Earth's orbit. So we will never see those not kind of stuck to the sun. So when the Heliodromos is being conducted and he has two figures with him, I've always imagined that it's likely an allusion to Mercury and Venus, who are always psychopompically guiding the sun into the underworld and then raising the sun again.
Oh, yeah. So there's another connection with the Hiramic
Well,
tragedy, as you said, which, I mean, I'm just kind of like going parallelomania because like I've not considered a lot of these things together, right? Like, so yeah, the senior deacon is a psychopomp. He's carrying messages, right? So he's acting a lot like Mercury or Apollo,
And he's
and
guiding
yeah,
the soul into the underworld,
yeah, and you referencing
circumambulation.
the yeah, and you referencing the Hieramic legend as a tragedy. It is a bit modeled after Greek tragedies in that one similarity is that it ends abruptly. Like there's not really resolution to the story. It just
Right.
boom, right? That's it, right?
Yeah,
And I've wondered, that's a weird way to tell a story, is like you just cut it off abruptly at a cliffhanger, let's say, right?
yeah,
Um, I've been reading about, the ending of the Gospel of Mark, how
yeah.
it originally just ends abruptly. Like
Right.
Jesus says, "Tell the apostles to meet me over there," but the women don't say anything because they're afraid. End of story, right? Then come the curtains,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking right now, it kind of mimics how it goes in real life, right? Like a family member dies, right?
Hmm.
What now? What do we do now? Right? It's almost as if like it's that same. I don't know what's going to happen. What Everything has changed, and that it kind of brings us into that tragedy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Things just end and somebody pokes their eyes out and wanders to Colonus, like with a brooch and then leaves. Like, well, as in the case of Oedipus, right? But yeah, well, much like that's not something that stops there with the tragedians. We see that. When was the last time you've watched like a 40s or 50 film noir film?
Never,
Oh,
unfortunately. Yeah.
yeah, check out some of those films because the ending is like, things will come to a head and then all of a sudden it just kind of stops and then credits are rolling. Like invariably, 40s and 50s film noir films just kind of like uh, rapidly conclude. But
Yeah. Yeah. So before I interjected with the whole stewards and deacons, you're going to make another point.
um, well, yeah, there was something about. Oh, yes, about going back to the Tauroctony, which is again that bas relief with Perseus on top of the bull, or Mithras on top of the bull, and he's slaying him. And on the underside, those three animals on the underside. Um, if let's say you're looking at Perseus and Taurus in the night sky, well, 180 degrees behind you would be Canis Major, um, Hydra, and Scorpio
Mm-hmm.
on the underside of the bull. So you have
Yeah.
Perseus and you have the bull, and then on the underside of the bull, you have those three constellations, which are, you know, depicted on the Tauroctony by literally what they are: a dog, a snake, and a scorpion. So there's,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that's beyond beyond
Mhm.
the possibility of being any sort of chance. That is an astrotheological, um, sort of set of symbolism there. It's undeniable.
Yeah. Now, do you have any idea what's going on there? Like, there seems to be two suns depicted. Like Mithras is depicted as a sun, and then there's the sun with the crown, and they're always looking at each other, right? So Mithras is always like this, and
Yeah,
then the he almost seems dressed as a king,
yeah.
the god soul.
Sol
Yeah,
Invictus. Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
so I think you had it right. There's this intellectual sun beyond the sun, and who knows which one is which? Who is the sort of the planetary, the stellar body, and who is the sort of sun beyond the sun? Now, something that's interesting that some ancient cultures would talk about was Saturn as the old sun. Have you ever heard that?
Never, but it makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Saturn as the ancient sun, So there could be something like you were saying. We only have fragments and whatever Franz Kuman and his gang were kind enough to translate, but we really don't know the Mithraic grade system very well. There's a lot of things they've pieced together through finding various Mithraea here and there,
Mhm.
but we can't really piece together um, the particulars of the ritual.
Yeah. Yeah, I so wish we could, because it's incredibly interesting that it was the dominant religion of the Roman Empire,
Mhm.
right? But we know next to nothing about it, right?
Well, that should be a testament to their
Secrecy.
obligation to
Yeah,
keep it inviolate, right? Yeah.
yeah. And
So
yeah, I mean, any speculate. I mean, it does seem kind of weird, right? Like Perseus is Mithras. He's also some kind of sun. He's also a little bit of Atlas,
right,
and
and he's Perseus, so he's
yeah, yeah.
stellar, planetary.
And the whole idea is, and then he's associated with Persia. Thus, the whole Mithras thing, that they're kind of equating it with Zoroastrianism,
Hmm.
right? And like the whole idea that the Romans thought, just as Romulus founded Rome, Perseus founded Persia, because the names are similar. So now they're associated, even though Perseus has nothing to do with Persia, they're like, oh yeah, this is the religion of Persia because of the name Perseus, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
he's the same as Mithras.
Yeah.
And I don't know, just piecing the whole thing together, like, I guess because he's slaying the bull, that causes the precession of the equinox, right?
Well, I don't know that it causes it, but I think it's an indicator of the Taurian age. So I think
Okay.
Zoroastrianism and maybe that proto-Mithraism. I know Mithras was Mitra, and he
Mm-hmm.
was a minor deity in several earlier panthea, right? So he had occurred um, earlier, but and he probably of some antiquity. So I think, and there are other people who think this, that the slaying of the bull um, is sort of a an indicator of the Taurian age. So kind of betraying the antiquity of that symbology, that it goes all the way back to the Taurian age, because and you see things like this when like for instance, Moses comes down off of Mount Sinai and he sees them worshiping the golden calf. So he blows the shofar, which is the ram's horn. And that is marking, from the astrotheological perspective, that is marking the precession of the sun at the vernal equinox from Taurus and preceding into Aries. So it's going from the first degree of Taurus back into the 30th degree of Aries. And then you see um, when Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and the end. I am the Lamb of God and the Fisher of men. He is talking about, what is a lamb? It's a baby ram, right? So he's talking about going from that first degree of Aries to the 30th degree of Pisces. And we see Christianity as a Piscean religion because the
Mm-hmm.
the fish glyph that came along, the
Yeah.
ichthys fish.
Mm-hmm.
We see the feeding of the 5,000 with the fish and the loaves of bread. Um, we see that he meets the two fishermen,
Mm-hmm.
um,
And then the drought of fish in John.
yeah, yeah. So there's all this Piscean sort of allusions, but he is at once the Lamb of God and the Fisher of Men, because he is straddling that cusp between the Aryan age, Aries the ram, and the Piscean age. So that's why and Aries is the beginning of the zodiac. So Pisces is the end of the zodiac. So it is the Alpha and the Omega. of the zodiac. That is the beginning and the end. You know, so that cusp between Aries and Pisces. In fact, NASA even calls that 0 degrees Aries. They call that 0 degrees right ascension. 0 degrees right ascension is the beginning of Aries. So it's something that's, you know, so ingrained that they have no choice but to mark that position. Even modern, you know, positivistic science marks
Yeah.
that position. So it's yeah, so I definitely think there's a good possibility that Mithras slaying the bull is an allusion to the Taurian processional age, which began about 4000 BCE. The inception of the Taurian processional age, where it would have come from the Geminian age, it preceded into Taurus about 4000 BC. So what does so as a Freemason, 4000 BCE should ring a bell for you, because that is the commencement of our Anno Lucas, our year of light. So in Freemasonry, for your listeners who don't know, we add 4000 years to the the regular date. You know, it's 2023 right now. So in Freemasonry, it's 6023, because our Anno Lucas is 4000 BCE, which was the commencement of the Taurian age. And that's why my first book has a zodiac wheel with a minotaur in front of it, because I'm alluding to the Anno Lucas of Freemasonry as a marker of the Taurian age.
Yeah. You know, and to tail onto that, you know, the Mithraic Tauroctony scene is a lot like who is it? Enki that slays the bull of heaven. Maybe I'm
Yeah,
off in that. Yeah.
yeah.
And
Enki slays it for Gilgamesh, because no, Enkidu, wasn't it? Enkidu, or it could have been Enki, but yeah, Gugulana, the bull of heaven, which
yeah.
was yeah.
And there's there's a lot of things to say about that. That ultimately, is that a creation myth? That's how the earth is created?
That you know, I'd have
That
to go back.
Yeah, and I think whoever slays the heavenly bull. Oh, here we have Lauren commented here. Enkidu. Enkidu is the
Enkidu,
answer we're
yeah,
looking for.
Enkidu, yeah.
Enkidu. Enkidu. And he's eventually killed, I think, for having slain the bull. And I think it's some kind of creation myth where that results in the creation of the world, right?
Mm,
But then you'd think, well, but then there's this pre-existing bull. There's at least somebody that's around to kill it, right? And then
right.
before that, there's like the cosmic egg, where like
Oh
the
yeah,
ultimate God springs from, like from chaos,
sure.
right? Which that's where we get
The
the
Orphic
waters.
egg, yeah.
Yeah, well, the Orphic egg, Mithras is often depicted as springing from a rock, and also
Yes,
like being on the inside of a kind of an egg-shaped rock, right?
I know the very
Yeah,
sculpture you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah, and that there's a parallel in Genesis where the Spirit of God roams over the face of the deep of the
Yeah.
waters. So a lot of people would say that the waters were pre-existing, and the waters symbolize the primordial chaos,
Well, it's
right?
this. Yeah, it's the same. You find another parallel of that in the Pymander or Pomandries, which is the first book of the Corpus Hermeticum, from the first or second or third, one of the first few centuries CE. Um, It's the first book of the Corpus Hermeticum, translated to Latin by Marsilio Ficino in the Renaissance, who was also working on a lot of Platonic literature at that time, which they got from the fall of the Byzantine. But yeah, so it says in the Pymander, it's essentially a Hermetic Genesis account. and they do talk about the firmament, the waters of the
Mhm.
firmament, and a lot of the same stuff, like you know, brooding over the face of the deep. Um, you know, like the Spirit of God moved upon the
Mhm.
waters, and just before the creative fiat.
Yeah. Yeah. What myth system is that?
That's Hermeticism or
Oh, got
Hermetism.
it.
Yeah, it's in the Corpus Hermeticum, which is 17 books pseudepigraphically attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. And it was a very popular sort of philosophical uh, order, I guess you could say. They were a sort of philosophical slash theological group. They were, in fact, Gilles Quispel uh, says that they've recently found that they had, at that time he said this, that they had recently found documents that the Hermetists met in a Freemason like setting,
Hmm.
where they recognized each other by certain tokens. And he said there was a almost a fraternal order of Hermeticists, and they found uh, some fragments of their uh, to support that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So is Hermes Trismegistus, is he's after the when Genesis was supposed to have been written, yeah?
Yeah, so there was some contention about that, because when Ficino found these documents, these old Hermetic codices, he he thought that they had found a contemporary of Moses, perhaps even one who had informed Moses or instructed Moses. But some years later, a philologist or linguist named, let me see if I can get his name, Casaubon, Isaac Casaubon, um, did some of the work on um, dating the dating these this literature, and happened to put it um, more around the turn of that century. So first, second, third century CE. Yeah, my dog is really going nuts right now.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
Sorry to
I didn't
bring
hear
that up,
anything.
but yeah, I should probably get to him soon. This has been
Sure thing.
fascinating, Elliot. This has been
Yeah,
great.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's almost like we just started and we're kind of coming up on 2 hours here. So
Yeah.
that's good. But yeah, no, that's great. So yeah, maybe we should get going here. Any final thoughts or anything that you wanted to say to conclude?
Well, just I always want to plug my astrological stuff. I've been doing. I'm also a consulting astrologer, so but I ground that in history and theory, and I've gone all the way back to the beginning of the doctrine, first century BCE. So I'm accredited in Hellenistic astrology. I'm currently studying medieval Renaissance astrology and the work of William Lilly, particularly horary astrology, which is question based astrology. Um, I have a website that is my name.com, so jamiepaullamb.com. There are links to my books on the website. There are links to other sort of articles and blogs that I've written, and a bunch of great information. And of course, there are ways to get in contact with me to schedule consultations for astrology or tarot. Um, I'm a very proficient tarotist as well, and maybe sometime I'll come back and we could talk about the wealth of symbolism that's contained in the tarot, and how, well, I'll leave you with this one thing. How people sometimes ask me, what is the best way to learn the tarot? Is there a good book? And I almost invariably say, no, there is not. I don't know of a good book that's a one-stop shop to learn tarot, but probably the best thing you can do is learn something about astrology, something about history, something about the Catholic and Orthodox Mass, something about Renaissance history, something about alchemy, something about humoral and temperamental theory, something about Pythagorean numerology, something about Jungian psychoanalysis, XYZ, all these other things, because that's the best way. What makes you a good tarot reader is that is to approach it sort of adjacently, so, and then letting the cards kind of, because then you could look at the symbolism of the cards, which, I use Tarot de Marseille, so these are really stark, austere woodcut images that are very strong, and have just a wealth of symbolism in them. So if you learn these other disciplines, that's how you learn how to read the tarot. And I think it's that way with a lot of things. To approach the tarot directly is like, how are you going to, I mean, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, you got to build up around it to have a reference point capable of exegetically interpreting the symbolism.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Yeah,
suppose that's
like,
called I suppose that's called a hermeneutic approach, I think they would say.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Elliot.
Yep. And everybody, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Where could I see the video?
I can give you the link, but right after the broadcast, it takes a little bit to process, and then it'll be up.
Sounds good. Thanks, Elliot.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.